Are you addicted to sugar and you don't even know it? Do you crave sugar and sweets? Do you sneak or hide sugary foods? Do you feel anxious or uneasy about the thought of not even having them? Do you have feelings of guilt after consuming sweets? Do you treat yourself with a sweet treat as a reward or to feel better? Well, you are likely addicted to sugar. And yes, it is an addiction.
So I want to know how we can find out, how can we tell if we have a sugar addiction actually? What are some of the actual symptoms of a sugar addiction? What are the red flags?
So yes, we're going to talk about the symptoms, but let's first talk a little bit about the causes of sugar addiction. And one of the areas that is really interesting to me is that the taste buds on the tongue are located at the front of the tongue, which we can see here. And what that means from nature is that in order for an animal to know if something is safe or not, historically, and of course animals still do this, is where do they first touch is the tip of their tongue.
Oh.
And in nature, things that are sweet are safe, and that's the correlation. So it's really interesting that, as humans, on the tip of our tongue, that's the first part of the pleasurable experience of sugar, is that it is, the first that we experience as a food is going into our mouth, which I find is fascinating. The first part of that now connection between tasting the sugar is that it then goes up into the brain. So the brain gets the signal that I'm eating something sweet and pleasurable. And then that goes to something called the nucleus accumbens. And that is right here in the forebrain. And this has a lot to do with our motor function. So this is part of now that dopamine response and the reward center of the brain. So what this is doing now is this allows this part of the brain now to be activated and will actually allow us to move and to go towards getting it again and again and again. And that's part of the addictive quality and, setting off this dopamine in the brain that allows for that to happen over and over and over again. And the other center that is activated is the opioid receptors. And the opioids, we know, are a common addictive substance.
Sure, yeah.
And, this is signaled by the sugar as well. And what, the research has shown is that there is definitely a relationship, which we can see here, between the opioid and the sugar intake. And it's important to know that, yes, sugar and cocaine and a lot of these substances are just as addictive. And one study actually found out of France that sugar and the intense sweetness of sugar surpassed the cocaine addiction in terms of wanting to have that reward over and over and over again. And this is in 2007, this was actually presented at the Society of Neuroscience and showed that when rats who metabolize sugar much like we do, so as much as people say, rat studies don't work, it's not a good measure of, how humans digest and interact and how their brains work, they are, in most cases, when we're talking about sugar and the dopamine response, very, very similar. And the rats were given a choice between water sweetened with saccharin, so sugar, and intravenous cocaine. And 94% of them chose the saccharin water over the cocaine.
Are you serious?
94%.
Sorry. I don't mean to laugh, but that is kind of odd. I wasn't expecting that.
Exactly. And so when the water was sweetened with the sugar, of course, the same preference was observed. And the rats were like crazy for the sugar water. And when they were offered more and more cocaine, they didn't change their preference. Their preference was still for the sugar or the saccharin water as opposed to the cocaine. So what does that tell you? And, this came out years ago and people have been talking about it on the internet, but what does that tell you? And why are we not changing our sugar addiction? And that's the whole purpose of the show. I mean, I have young children and teenagers, but of all ages, and sugar addiction is an issue, and it's something that I think we need to talk more about. And as much as industry is really good at making us, yes, sugar, eat more, eat more, eat more. I think we really have to make those conscious efforts to decrease our sugar intake, especially with what's happened in the last few months, because we know that the comorbidities of certain viral infections, I'm just going to say, you know, and being overweight and being addicted to sugar, they're all correlated. We've got to get, and we have that choice. We have that choice to be able to get over these addictions, to get healthier, and not to be, you know, in those unfortunate circumstances if we do become sick with, you know, something or a virus or something that's out there that we don't have sometimes as much control over. We do have control over our own body, our own health, and getting better and getting off the sugar and getting healthier and exercising and getting that weight off, because we've got to kick the addiction. And if sugar is your issue, I'm just going to put it out there to you that this is something that it's more serious than losing the weight. It's so much more than that. It's more about getting healthy so that, you know, in that unfortunate circumstance that one of these things from the outside world is going to attack you, that you're actually saving your own life by taking those steps right now to get healthier.
That is fascinating to me. It really is. And it does seem like we do get some sort of an emotional reward from sugar. Is that what it is?
Yes, and that's part of the brain as well. Okay. So as much as it has the effect on the nucleus accumbens that we talked about, but in the diagram, which we can see here on the screen, we can see that it also affects a different reward center. So the emotional center, the amygdala of the brain, the sugar and the dopamine has an effect there, but also on the hippocampus. And this is the memory center of the brain, which is so interesting. And this allows us to have the memory of, ooh, that tasted so good. That was so pleasurable. That, you know, chocolate cake or those muffins that grandma made, they were so good. And you remember that in a positive way. And that relationship in the brain is stored there. So now every time you see muffins or you see a chocolate cake, it reminds you of that interaction with grandma. Yeah. And that is part of the addiction of feeling good. And that's why we go to the sugar sometimes to feel good, because it's stored in the brain as pleasurable and it's remembered there. So I just found that it's so fascinating, you know, to know, and even for myself, because I've always loved sugar. I mean, truth be told, I still, if I were to allow myself to have a lot of sugar, then it is very pleasurable. But what's interesting as well is that broccoli, of all things, so we were talking about dopamine. So all these effects on the brain have a lot to do with our opioid receptors and the dopamine. And the dopamine, makes us feel good, and that's why sugar stimulates that. Well, broccoli has no effect on our dopamine.
Okay, well, it doesn't affect my dopamine, I know that.
So doesn't that explain a lot? I mean, so no wonder the kids aren't asking, Mommy, I mean, some kids do, but come on. Yeah. Like most kids and most adults, give me more, I need more broccoli, I need more broccoli.
I don't want those chips or those cookies. Broccoli, wow, no, it doesn't really happen.
It doesn't. Right? It doesn't have that same, effect on the brain and on our pleasure centers. So this is, it is fascinating.
It is really fascinating, actually, and I think that gives us that connection when we see a packaging in a grocery store. I'm getting back to that again, and I see that giant whatever it was that I really liked, and it reminds me, like you just said, that memory kicks in. Yeah. That was a good feel. Yeah. I'll take that good feeling again. Thank you very much. Right?
Exactly.
This is all amazing to me. Why is this the first time we're hearing this?
Well, I think the powers that be sometimes don't want us to know the truth about, those addictive qualities. It's a big business, let's be honest, sure. Right? And so as much as we have it in our own power to be able to have these positive effects on what we have the choice of putting into our body, let's overcome that, and let's use the tips that we're getting to in just a few moments to get over that, that addiction, to be able to start eating less and less. And I think for some people, which we'll talk about, cutting it out completely is definitely the way to go, but certainly everything in moderation. If you can do it, if you can control that brain and the dopamine and those pleasure centers, for a lot of addicts, they simply, and quite seriously, they cannot ever have that substance again. And it may be the same for you with the sugar. And what's interesting is that people that are overweight and they've overdone it with the sugar, is that what happens is a down regulation of their dopamine receptors, meaning that the receptors aren't going to have that same response anymore. So they actually need more and more of the sugar to get that high, to get that good pleasurable feeling again. And much like drugs, and this is why
Yeah.
some of the drugs and the opioid receptors as well
Yeah.
have that effect. So to me, I think it's really interesting to know this, and one of the other aspects is certainly with the physical features of getting over the sugar addiction is to know also, and I've always said this on television when I'm educating people about, their microbiome, the gut, and what's going on there, is that you can have some of the less favorable organisms. Candida is one of them in the gut, and this is something that, whether it's candida or parasites, they can actually make you crave sugar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, and this is one of the ways that you can counteract this is to do a candida cleanse and to do a parasite cleanse, which is something I talk about in other videos and other formats on television. That it's really important once in a while to get rid of some of those bad organisms that are in the gut and making you crave, because they survive off of the sugar and they replicate. So the more you feed them the sugar, the more they replicate and make you crave more and more sugar. So that's one aspect of this with the sugar addiction as well, that it's sometimes a very easy way to eradicate, and get over that sugar addiction. Yes, taking the dopamine and taking the pleasure centers out of it, taking that out of the equation, but sometimes the candida cleanse or the parasite cleanse is a great way to lessen those cravings so that you're not always going towards those sugary foods.
This is mind-boggling to me because we've spoken about parasites before.
Yes.
And so there's a lot going on in our body that we're not even aware of, a lot of things happening in there, a lot of planning going on, a lot of activity. So this is really an addiction in the true sense of the word addiction.